So, you've probably heard of the Tiananmen Square massacre, right? Or maybe you haven't heard of it. I mean, it was like 30 years ago, and unless you're some sort of history nerd like me, it makes sense you don't know much about it. Another reason why you might have never heard about it is because this event is actively censored by the Chinese government, both in China and abroad even to this day. What happened in Tiananmen Square is one of the most important events in modern Chinese history, and I think that it is important to know about it as it helps explain the current social and political situation in China. For some context, it's 1989. Mao Zedong, the one who started the whole communism thing in China, had been dead for a while at this point. He did leave a successor who would follow his policies and ideologies, but that guy was ousted by this guy, Deng Xiaoping, who clashed with Mao's ideologies and, when he rose to power at the start of the 80s, started a series of reforms that, de-Maoificated the country. He tried to correct some of Mao's mistakes during the Cultural Revolution and introduced the country to the free market and that sort of thing. Anyways, one of Deng's closest allies was Hu Yaobang, who became the chairman of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, in 1982, which is the highest position someone can get in China. Hu Yaobang was kind of liberal. I mean, along with Deng's ideologies, he did have some positive views regarding transparency in the government and democratization of some of its aspects. He really tried to make a push to leave behind the days of Mao, openly criticizing his policies and ideologies. However, these types of views did put him very much at odds with the rest of the CCP, who often clashed with him and eventually got him fired. On the other hand, these views resonated with the students at the time who were starting to grow tired of the current state of the country. At the time, there were many problems facing China: corruption and nepotism in the government, repression of freedom of speech, unemployment, inflation, and a general intellectual and spiritual stagnation. Through the decade, student protests started to sprout, trying to highlight these issues and basically calling out the government. These protests, while having a shared goal, were kind of poorly organized and did not have a concrete plan of action. This is why in 1989, when Hu Yaobang died, the protesters kind of just grabbed him as a figurehead for the movement and intensified the protests, in particular by stationing themselves in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, where they remained for months, occasionally clashing with the police and the army. On June 4th, 1989, the government had enough of this and ordered the military to be deployed and attack the protesters. It isn't known how many people died, but it is estimated to be in the thousands of people. Afterwards, the government tried to cover the whole thing up by pushing a misleading narrative of events and censoring national media. That censorship extended beyond this event, and from then on, the government really started to crack down on outlets that criticized them or opposed their narrative, a policy that lasts to this day and lets the Chinese government mold narratives to their will and control their population more easily. Nowadays, what happened in Tiananmen Square is usually downplayed by the government, and their manufactured narrative is still being upheld, extending even in the education system and social media. A lot of the reforms that Hu Yaobang and Deng Xiaoping were pushing were also abandoned. However, it wouldn't really be accurate to call them heroes or anything. They were still very much members of the CCP, and while they sought many reforms, they still had interest in preserving some of the authoritarian practices already in place. It is even speculated that Deng Xiaoping was the one who gave the order to attack the protesters. Also, some of the problems being called out in the Tiananmen protests were never resolved, persisting to this day, and some of them getting even worse over time, leading to the current authoritarian government that rules China. I think that knowing about these events, even if they're not from our own countries, can help inform us about our own issues. Some of the problems and authoritarian practices from China can also be seen in other parts of the world, and if we can learn from the mistakes of our predecessors, we can learn to fight these problems better and maybe, one day, lead a successful revolution.